Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 things the Witchwood got right. Now, in any given Hearthstone expansion, there are things that go well, things that go poorly, things that Blizzard nails, and things that they miss the mark on. And the community is usually pretty vocal about the things they like and don't like, and I wanted to share my take on expansions moving forward as well. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 different aspects of the Witchwood expansion I thought went really well and are good signs for the future of the game, or at the very least, the current state of the game. And to be fair, of course, I will be identifying some things I think went wrong in a future video as well, so keep an eye out for that. But for now, I want to talk about the aspects Blizzard actually succeeded on. So let's go ahead and jump into this list, the 5 things the Witchwood got right. Up first is the theme and the fantasy of the Witchwood. So basically, this comes down to the idea behind it all, the storylines, the lore, the artwork, the mechanics of the cards sometimes reflecting that theme or fantasy. And I think the Witchwood's pretty perfect in that regard. Not every expansion fits people's personal tastes, but I love the spooky, creepy, haunted forest vibe of the Witchwood, and I think Blizzard did a great job delivering on that vibe with the cards and the artwork. There are a lot of ghostly, spooky, scary things. There are haunted trees. There are mechanics like Echo that are very ghostly in their effect. So I'm thrilled with how this one turned out. I love all of the different aspects of the theme of the Witchwood. On top of that, I think they did a great job introducing actual lore characters. The Witchwood is the Blackwalled, a forest outside of Gilneas, the home of the Worgens, and of course Worgens are pretty spooky and scary too. But that means we got characters like Gin Greymane, who actually showed up in the expansion, a major lore character. That doesn't always happen in Hearthstone these days. Lately, most of the cards and characters you see are just created for Hearthstone itself. So we don't always get identifiable, known Warcraft characters. This time around, we actually got a handful, and I think that's a great turn. I want to find some people I know and recognize some characters I love in each and every expansion. Now, was Gin Greymane perfect from a fantasy standpoint himself? No, I don't really think the card reflected the Worgen aspect of Gin Greymane perfectly, but if you look beyond that, you look towards everything else, man, the setting is just so wonderful. The artwork is whimsical, but also really creepy and scary at the same time, which is a hard mix to nail, but I think Blizzard's artists absolutely knocked it out of the park there. So this is something Blizzard usually does pretty well. This isn't a surprise, but the Witchwood personally just struck a chord with me. I love this whole setting and fantasy, so this has been one of my favorites so far in that regard. There's been a few that have stood out, but the Witchwood has really been awesome. So the next thing I think the Witchwood got right was keywords. And usually in any given Hearthstone expansion, there are a few new keywords or mechanics introduced. And specifically with the Witchwood, we got 2 big ones with Rush and Echo. And Rush is clearly seeing a lot of play across a couple different cards. Things like Scaleworm and Vicious Scalehide come to mind first and foremost. There are a handful of other Rush cards that seeing some fringe play here and there. Beyond that, a deck like Rush Warrior is kind of a tier 2, tier 3 deck that's somewhat playable as well. And I think Rush has the likelihood to succeed even more in the future of Hearthstone if they keep up with it. It seems like they want to shift from Charge to Rush. So as far as I'm concerned, Rush was done really well. I think it's balanced, it's interesting, it's fun to play with despite being a relatively simple keyword. It makes the game feel smoother and faster and more interactive, which is a really nice accomplishment for Hearthstone. Now, Echo is the other major keyword, and we're not seeing quite as much play from Echo cards. There are certainly a few that pop up in decks here and there, things like Phantom Militia and Squashling, Warpath, or as I like to call it, Forest Fire shows up sometimes. None of those are parts of giant, really popular tier 1 decks at the moment, but still they are interesting and do cool things. And Echo itself is just a really fun keyword. The idea of repeatable effects that started with something like Unstable Evolution and continues now, that's really neat. And almost any Echo card I've played has been enjoyable, even if it hasn't been particularly great. And that said, I think that Blizzard did a good job of avoiding the risk of making an Echo card way too powerful. There was a lot of risk there that something could have just been really oppressive if they got it wrong. So they kept a good, nice balance between all these Echo cards. All of them seem at least halfway decent, except for some of the throwaway stuff like Walnut Sprite or whatever that card's called. But most of the ones that were probably intended to be playable look pretty playable. They're interesting in Arena as well. So I think Echo from a gameplay standpoint is solid right now with the potential to be even better in the future. And from a fantasy standpoint, moving back to our first point, it's really awesome. The idea that these things are repeatable. Cards like Sound the Bells, for instance, that's awesome because it's like a bell going off over and over again. That's really, really well done. So those two keywords are great. Another one I think I should talk about, maybe you wouldn't necessarily call it a keyword, but it is bolded card text on 2 cards, and that is the start of game keyword that you see with Gin Greymane and Baku the Moon Eater. And really, you could almost call this the even and odd mechanic, or the even and odd keyword if you were so inclined, but I'll refer to it as the start of game keyword. But in both instances, I think those are really well done too. The idea that an effect can happen right at the beginning of the game so that you get an instant impact from it and a reliable and consistent and controllable impact, that's really good compared to swingy cards like Barnes or Keleseth, for instance, where you might build your deck in a specific way to accommodate them, but then it becomes this really high roll instance. That's bad. Controllable, reliable effects like Baku and Gin are good. Have they been a little too strong? Maybe here and there, but they're in the right direction. And the fact that the even and odd deck building requirements exist, that's pretty cool too. I do think it's unfortunately a little bit narrow in its focus when it comes to building your deck. Like, it's really walking you down a path without leaving a whole lot of room for leeway or creativity from the player itself. But nonetheless, it's a fresh way to build decks and a fresh way to look at the game. And it does add some strategic element to both sides, yourself and your opponent. And that's pretty good too. So essentially across the board, I like all of the mechanics that were introduced with the Witchwood, and I think they're all good signs that Blizzard understands right now as players what we want and what we'd like to see, and they're headed in that direction consistently moving forward. So up next, I'd like to talk about utility cards. And what I mean by utility cards are cards that are designed to do something really, really specific that might not otherwise be available. So for instance, think about cards like Voodoo Doll, which serves as a neutral single target removal option. And not every class necessarily has access to neutral single target removal, or single target removal, I should say. So it becomes this utility tool that certain decks can slot in and have a thing that does this specific thing. Beyond that, we got some tutor draw utility cards, things like Witchwood Piper and Sandbinder allow you to draw specific things out of your deck. I guess you could even add Town Crier into that list for Warrior. So they serve this very specific purpose for helping you find things you might need. And that allows you a neat tool to build decks in a creative way or hunt for specific pieces, for specific metas, for specific matchups, those sorts of things. So all of these add these extra options and control to you as the player when you're building your deck. And maybe, yes, you sacrifice a little bit because they aren't the strongest cards in and of themselves, but they allow you to achieve some end purpose. And I think that's a really good trend in Hearthstone. It adds some depth, some strategy, some extra layers to the game that we haven't necessarily seen in the past. And this list continues with other cards too. It's not just the ones I named. For instance, things like Chameleos come to mind. That's a really cool utility card. It's a scouting option in and of itself. It's maybe not all that exciting, but it's just a neat piece to add in that gives you some kind of strategic advantage. Even things like Nightmare Amalgam, for instance, like that is the kind of the ultimate utility card because it can be utilized across so many different kinds of archetypes and all of those tribal sort of synergy decks. So a lot of those different pieces seem to be added in with the Witchwood, and I think that's something Blizzard's keeping in mind moving forward. Just creating cards that don't necessarily narrowly define a path for you when you're building your deck, but nonetheless give you a lot of different options and tools to pick from so that you can do something creative, do something cool, do something very strategic and tactical when you're defining your deck. And that's a nice trend. That's something I hope continues for a long time because I like having access to all these different tools. The next aspect of the Witchwood that I think is really good and maybe a little bit underrated is that we got access to a lot of really solid, cheap cards. And when I say cheap, I mean affordable to craft, namely commons and rares. And in fact, there weren't many really, really good epics that you had to craft. So for instance, really the only epic that's seeing a ton of play right now is probably Voodoo Doll. and even that is only very specifically across a couple different classes and archetypes. It's not like the past expansion, for instance, where you just had to have Corridor Creeper to compete for a really long time. So most of the neutral cards you're going to need to add across lots of decks are actually things that are common and rare. So for instance, you can think about cards like Vicious Scalehide. That's a common. Rotten Applebomb. That's a common. Hinge Clan Thug, which right now is kind of just a rogue card, maybe a hunter card occasionally, but that's a common. You've got rares like Scale Worm, for instance, pretty commonly played. That's only a rare card. So a lot of the pieces that you need, and in fact some control pieces as well, which is fairly rare, like Rotten Applebomb, for instance, a nice slow defensive card, are still pretty cheap to craft. I think this has been one of the least expensive expansions. That's a difficult phrase to say. But anyway, one of the cheapest to get off the ground with as a free-to-play or growing player. You can get a lot of the cards you need without spending too much, and you don't feel like you're being locked out of too many things either. And even beyond that, when you look at the legendaries, which certainly aren't always cheap to craft for a lot of people, they can often be really punishing, in fact. There are kind of just two big ones you need right now that can get by as far as neutral legendaries are concerned, and that's Gin Greymane and Baku the Mooneater. So even when you're investing in Witchwood legendaries, it's pretty clear at this point which ones you're going to want moving forward. You're not going to have to craft specific class legendaries quite as often. Really just, I guess maybe Lord Godfrey, maybe Hagatha are the class legendaries that are being played at the moment. So it doesn't ever feel like you're pigeonholing all of your dust into a single deck or a single class, because if you craft Gin or Baku, you know you're going to have some flexibility with how you play those moving forward. Not to mention they really do empower decks by themselves, so you don't always necessarily need a ton of complementary pieces. So across the board, this feels like a pretty accessible expansion from a dust standpoint, and that's something Blizzard has really been trending away from lately. I felt like the last few expansions were really hard to compete. Kobolds and Catacombs had tons of epics that you needed that were really expensive. Frozen Throne had all of the Death Knights you probably had to get because they're all played. That's a lot of different legendaries that only each work in a single class. So I think Witchwood finally got that right, making this a cheaper expansion, which to me is always a great thing. The game needs to be cheaper in general, more accessible to lots of different players. So maybe that's a trend that will continue, and the game will feel a little bit easier and better to play for free-to-play people in the future. And then finally, there's one last thing here I think the Witchwood got right, and that is the Monster Hunt, the single-player mode for the Witchwood. This is similar to dungeon runs, of course, that we saw in Kobolds and Catacombs, somewhat similar to adventures that we had seen released in the past. But the great thing about the Monster Hunt is twofold in my mind. Number one, it's totally free. You don't have to pay for it like adventures in the past, much like Dungeon Run. It gives people a single-player way to enjoy the game without having to commit to buying packs. And it has a lot of replayability on top of that, so it's a great mode for anybody who just wants to experience kind of the fun and interactions and lore and theme and fantasy of Hearthstone without necessarily all of the competitive headaches. Dungeon Run also got that right. Monster Hunt repeated it in great fashion. Beyond that, the other thing I think Monster Hunt got done really well is that you got to play as some new, unique classes that had very interesting hero powers, right? Toki Time Tinker, resetting your turn, that's so cool. Darius Crowley with the Cannoneer, the placement and positioning of the repeatable ping effect, that thing's super cool and really hard to learn. And it requires a lot of skill and fun and patience to master. And beyond that, the other two were great as well. So all four were really fun designed classes. The bosses, again, were unique and interesting as always. Lots of fresh artwork, all kinds of new cards and treasures and interesting things to explore. The amount of stuff that was packed into the Monster Hunt was really impressive. And I expected that with Dungeon Run because that was going to be their first big single-player return to fashion, like this awesome new single-player mode. I guess they did it with the Lich King and Frozen Throne as well. But Dungeon Run kind of changed it and made it bigger and more awesome in scope. And I thought they might lose that a little bit moving forward. I thought they might take a lazier approach. But really, I thought Monster Hunt followed up really nicely. It delivered everything I expected from Dungeon Run, and in some ways even more because of all the new classes and hero powers and interesting new mechanics that were introduced. So I played the Monster Hunt more than I ever play single-player content. I usually ignore single-player content almost completely. The Monster Hunt I played actually quite a bit on stream. I had fun. Everybody enjoyed it. So more so than ever, I think that was single player content that absolutely they got right and was really enjoyable from top to bottom. So well done, Blizzard, for adding an additional game mode totally for free that was really, really enjoyable. And there you go. Those are my 5 things that I loved about the Witchwood. Now, I know not everybody's going to agree. You might think these 5 things are great, but you might still think the expansion sucks. Well, hang tight. I'm going to put out a video talking about some of the things I didn't like quite so well. That said, I still think the Witchwood was a pretty good expansion when you consider everything across the board. Yes, the power level might be a little low. Yes, the meta might have remained stale. All things that I'll discuss in the next video. But nonetheless, I'm still enjoying myself. The theme and fantasy do a lot of the work there. This is such a cool expansion, just the artwork and the style and the ideas behind everything, the lore. It's wonderful. So I liked it. That said, please share your opinion in the comments below. Do you think I got it wrong on these 5 points? Or were there other things that you personally enjoyed about it? I want to hear your take. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.